Dobry wieczór. Witam Państwa jeszcze raz bardzo serdecznie w Austriackim Forum Kultury.
Very warmly to the Austrian Cultural Forum, to a meeting with Marjorie Perloff, a distinguished American historian and literature critic, essayist, expert on the literature of 19th, 20th century, especially avant-garde literature. We're really glad that you're with us. We are honored.
We are really grateful that you honor us with your presence. So maybe we should have headphones for Professor Marjorie Perloff. Yes. Agnieszka, could I?
I should put them on.
Yeah.
No? Okay.
Okazją do tego spotkania jest polskie wydanie książki Marjorie Perloff.
We are meeting here as we've got now the Polish edition of a book by Marjorie, The Edge of Irony, Modernism in the Shadow of Habsburg Empire. Polish translation by Maciej Płaza
ukazał się właśnie w wydawnictwie Ossolineum.
In the Polish market,
Autorem posłowia do książki jest profesor Adam Lipsitz, który poprowadzi dzisiejsze spotkanie. Rozmowę będą tłumaczyć z angielskiego Marta Kalużna-Gołąb i Maciej Zgądek. I ze względu na pracę tłumaczy prosimy wszystkich Państwa zabierających głos o mówienie do mikrofonu. A teraz oddam już głos Dariuszowi Sośnickiemu, redaktorowi naczelnemu wydawnictwa Ossolineum, a Państwu życzę wielu intelektualnych i duchowych przeżyć. Dziękuję za uwagę.
Proszę Państwa, wydanie tej książki w Polsce dzisiaj to jest, mam nadzieję, że nie koniec, ale kolejny krok na dość długiej już drodze przyswajania dorobku Marjorie Perloff w języku polskim. Siedzi obok mnie Piotr Zomer, który jest, jak Państwo doskonale wiedzą, redaktorem literatury na świecie i to ten periodyk już od kilku dekad regularnie publikuje fragmenty książek Marjorie Perloff i sprawia, że jest ona w Polsce znana bardzo dobrze. Nie wiem, czy jest wiele krajów w Europie, które miały okazję tak dobrze zapoznać się z twórczością Marjorie Perloff. Cieszymy się, że autorka jest z nami. Wydaje mi się, że to pierwszy raz. Jestem po prostu bardzo wzruszony. Cieszę się, że książka tak świetnie wypadła po polsku dzięki Maciejowi Płazie, wybitnemu tłumaczowi polskiemu. I cieszę się, że posłowie do niej napisał Adam Lipsitz, bardzo kompetentny, znakomite. I cieszę się, że on to spotkanie prowadzi. Mam nadzieję, że wyjdą Państwo z tego spotkania nieco bogatsi duchowo, tak jakby to dzisiaj pewnie można było powiedzieć w innym towarzystwie i w innych okolicznościach. Życzę Państwu dużo wrażeń intelektualnych i dużo wrażeń i przeżyć. Dziękuję bardzo.
Okay, so now we'll switch to English. I hope it's okay with the audience. There are translators there, so you can rely on them. Yeah, okay, welcome. Obviously, this is indeed the occasion, the reason why we're meeting, especially that we're meeting here in the Austrian Cultural Forum, is because, as the publisher has just said, your book, The Edge of Irony, has been just published in Polish. Now, my first and obvious question is, well, why you wrote this book, and how does it relate to your former work, if possible?
I actually came to Austrian literature, my native literature, very late. I'm an American, and in earlier years I stuck very much to American. I mean, I also wrote on French and other things, but American poetry, and my field is really more poetry, and this book is mostly about fiction, so it's a departure. But what happened is that back in about 2000, James Laughlin, who was the publisher of New Directions, which is the great poetry publisher, also fiction in the United States, avant-garde fiction, who published Ezra Pound and William Carlos Williams, and was a good friend of mine. And I wrote a book on Wittgenstein. That's how it all started, and Wittgenstein's Ladder. And he said, and in the preface, I said a little bit about my roots, my Austrian roots, and he said, you really should write a memoir. And I said, no, I really don't like memoirs. I really don't want to do that. But then I did. It's more a cultural memoir, and that was The Vienna Paradox, and it came out in 2004. So quite a while ago, but it's selling very well now for some reason. Somehow or other, this whole, the refugee story, for all kinds of reasons, all the migrations today and so on, has really hit a nerve. And so people are really interested. And once I had written The Vienna Paradox, which was not all that literary, it was more personal, I started getting very interested in reading about the early century and the Habsburg Empire. And I wrote the book because I think especially in the United States, but in countries in general, this whole period is very badly understood. There's a lot about fin de siècle Vienna, the Vienna Waltz, all that stuff about Vienna, Johann Strauss, and also the fin de siècle, and Klimt, and Schiele, and so on. But the writers of the 20s and 30s, which are rather different, again, from the earlier fin de siècle Vienna, were really rather neglected. And so I wrote about Joseph Roth, who was such a great novelist, I think, in Musil, and more novelists in general, and Canetti's wonderful memoir, and Karl Kraus, to me, one of the most neglected writers. If you've never read The Last Days of Mankind, I don't know what that's called, and I don't know if there is a Polish edition of it.
Not yet.
The Last Days of Mankind is Karl Kraus's play that he started writing in 1914-15 about what's wrong with war, World War I. He was one of the only enemies of the war, World War I, which is still the crucial war. I take the point in the book that it's really all one long war. 1914-18, it's only 20 years, 1938, 1945. It's really in many ways one long war. And Karl Kraus understood that at a time where most writers were all in favor of war. If you go back and read Thomas Mann and Rilke, they were all ready to go to war. Great, save German culture. Germany has the great culture. France only has civilization, no culture. England has nothing, United States, I mean, not even a word, but we have to defend German culture. And Kraus wrote this wonderful play. It's much too long, you can't really perform it all, but there have been performances of part of it. He wrote this wonderful play, all based on actual documents, postcards, government documents, so that you see what war is like, not the usual thing about war on the front, but what war was like for the people at home, what the civil servants did, what people in general did, how they would close stores that had English names and change their names right away, and so on. And it's a very fascinating play, I think. And so I wanted to write about Kraus. And there's another Kraus book coming out now, for which I'm going to write the preface, which Yale University Press is publishing in the United States, which is Die dritte Walpurgisnacht. Those who know German, the third Walpurgisnacht. And that's the book that Kraus wrote when Hitler came to power. Begins with the sentence, über Hitler fällt mir nichts ein. About Hitler, I have nothing to say. And then, again, uses documents, absolutely unbelievable documents, to show what was being published in the newspapers in 1933, as soon as Hitler came to power. When, for instance, people got invitations to come to Kristallnacht and observe the burning of the books. Imagine that kind of thing. And that was a very hard book to translate. And the translator into English, Edward Timms, the minute he finished the book, he died about a week ago. It was so sad for me. Yeah, that just happened. But anyway, so I wanted to write about that period. And of course, I'm no expert on any of the individual authors, so I felt it was a little presumptuous in some ways. But on the whole, it was well received even in Austria, which is nice, because I really wrote it for a non-Austrian audience in a way, thinking that I wanted other people to understand Austria better, because I think it is not understood in the United States or in England, in the Anglophone countries at all, or in France, that Austria is very different from Germany. It's always considered a kind of footnote to Germany. And you can read textbooks about the German novel, and there will be some Austrian novels mentioned, just as if they're just part of the whole thing. Kafka is usually sometimes called a Czech author, sometimes called a Jewish author, etc. But I mean, Kafka is a creature of the Austro-Hungarian Empire. So is Paul Celan, who I have a long chapter on. I didn't write on Kafka because there's such a big literature on Kafka, I didn't quite dare. But Celan has often been misunderstood, I think, is that he was absolutely, in many ways, even though he came from Chernowitz, now in the Ukraine, was very much of an Austrian author in many ways. And what I felt very much was that Austria is very different from Germany in being a Catholic country, and in being a much more Eastern country, and in having a very different sensibility. And I don't think that's well enough understood, how different it is, so that you can't just say German and it's all the same thing. And in fact, most of my writers didn't like Germany. Joseph Roth hated Germany and only wanted to be stationed in France as a journalist. Celan had to go through Germany when he went to France to medical school. Didn't want to have anything to do with Germany. So it was very different, and Austria was closer to Poland, in a way closer to the Eastern countries, of course, because it had all been so much part of the same world. And I think there was a much better understanding in that sense, and I think that's something that's still not fully understood in that way.
Well, thanks. You somehow started already answering my second question and my third question, but my second, the second question would be perhaps more about the what brings together those authors, those 6 authors that you discuss in the book. You introduce the idea of Austro-modernism, or the Austrian type or post-Habsburgian type of modernism in the book. And if you could just say a word about how you understand the term, and how it is different from other modernisms that you also discuss in your previous, in other books.
Yeah, that's important. I had written a lot about modernism and the avant-garde in France, whether Picasso, whether Duchamp, who's one of, to me, crucial artists, and of course, British and American modernism, although the joke is always, in Britain there wasn't very much modernism. It was not much avant-garde anyway. It continued the Victorian line in many ways. But the avant-garde that I worked on when I wrote The Futurist Moment, which is a book that was published in 1986 about Italian and Russian, the Russian avant-garde.
The Futurist Moment, right?
The Futurist Moment. That moment in 1913, it was really about the year 1913, which was to me a fabulous year, when you have such incredible art, architecture, music, the rites of spring, and literature, poetry, Apollinaire, Sandra. That literature is characterized by collage, fragmentation, really very hyper-modern devices, lack of good, clear syntax, great difficulty, and it leads to people like Ezra Pound, who I've written quite a bit about and is one of my favorite poets, and so on. Now, in that sense, Austrian literature was often judged not to be modern at all. Not these writers. They're pretty straightforward. Even Karl Kraus, even in The Last Days of Mankind, certainly Kennedy, and even Celan, who's a difficult poet, but quite coherent grammatically, syntactically. It's very elliptical in some ways, but it's not like the Russian, I mean, if you think of Malevich, and if you think of the Russian poets, Khlebnikov, who are really strange and really do an entirely different, non-realistic thing, Austrian literature seems quite realistic, more straightforward. But when I reread, especially Musil, I realized it isn't really straightforward. It's very ironic. It's so deeply ironic that in its own way, it's more, what shall I say, radical than Marinetti and some of these other writers. For instance, in Der Mann ohne Eigenschaften, The Man Without Qualities, the Musil, it's supposed to take place before 1918, when they're getting ready for the Jubilee, the Emperor's Jubilee. It was written in 1930, but if you read the book carefully, it's obviously about the post-war period, post-World War I, because he'll talk about the traffic and the cars, and there wasn't really any traffic yet in 1913 and so on. So that he does that in order to show how bad the politics were and how strange the politics were. So it's a very difficult book in a way, and it isn't straightforward. So that Austro-modernism has its own quality. First of all, it's really Austro-Jewish modernism in many ways, because most of the writers were, and Musil was not, but his wife was. He was also exiled by the Nazis. Anyway, it's a very special literature that has an irony so deep that it's not realistic, it's not straightforward, and it's not really any easier than these very difficult works, let's say, by Khlebnikov, but it's very different from them. And so it was hard to characterize, really, in a way, because I originally had sort of thought, well, it isn't really quite modern yet, it's more old-fashioned. But that's not really true. That's not really true. It is something very new in its way. And it comes down, I think it has had a great influence on Thomas Bernhard. You have writers in the 50s. I was going to continue it into the 50s, and I have a chapter on Bernhard and Ingeborg Bachmann, because I have really no women. It's a problem perhaps but there was nobody I felt was really at that fit in the book very well. But it's had a great, I mean, all these writers have had a great influence on Bachmann, Ingeborg Bachmann, Thomas Bernhard, Ilse Eichinger, and I'm very interested now. I now want to do something on, if I can, on the Wiener group of the poets, the concrete poets, who really aren't known outside at all. Gerhard Rühm, I don't know if you all know Gerhard Rühm at all. Gerhard Rühm, of course, there was Achleitner. Gerhard Rühm is still alive, and my daughter Nancy, who is an art curator at the Getty Museum, did an exhibition on concrete poetry where she included quite a bit, and she's doing an anthology now for Reaction Press in England, and she got very interested in Gerhard Rühm, who right now has an exhibit on in Vienna, together with the American poet Susan Howe, on whom I've written quite a bit, a wonderful poet, and they seem very different, but there's very interesting work there, and of course Ernst Jandl, that is really still quite unknown outside, very hard to translate. That's one of the problems. That's why Krauss is not known outside Vienna, because he's very hard to translate. But I think we have to try. We have to try to do translations. And the best translations can do equivalents. In other words, not translate literally, but do a translation that will have the same kind of thinking, right? In a way, it's about the best you can do with some of these poets. But there are very interesting poets. And when I was in the Literaturmuseum in Wien now, I was startled. They have beautiful exhibits, and they have a whole sound room where they play all the sound poetry and the concrete poets, so that's very well represented there, and little videos. And it's popular because people can access it also as video, as a kind of video art. So.
Great.
I hope that helps.
Well, again, quite a few questions that I had in mind.
I'm sorry if I'm going on too long.
Super cool. I didn't have to work. Well, now, if we could stay a little bit with the issue, with the key problem of irony, and perhaps think about what is this irony directed towards? I mean, what they are ironic about. And the second thing would be, to what extent, I mean, all the writers that you're looking at are in the shadow of the Habsburg Empire. They
Distant
write
places.
After the collapse of the empire. How does it affect the writing? How do you see the link between the collapse of the empire and the quality, the Austrian modernist writing?
That's a very good question, and it's a very interesting thing. If we take, say, Joseph Roth's The Radetzky March, his other novels too, but especially The Radetzky March, people expect it to be, and this is what makes the irony so complex, most books, let's say, about World War I, written after it, after the terrible fall of the empire, are terribly critical. Awful, and this, and it was imperialism, and all the usual things, like all the writing we have today. It's amazing how uniform it sometimes is. The same critiques take place all the time. But the interesting thing about Joseph Roth is that although he was Jewish from Galicia, came from a small town, came from Lviv, came to Vienna. He happened to arrive right before the start of World War I and was very happy. He got a horse of his own and he could participate. He wasn't an aristocrat, but he could sort of have a great old time. And then the war broke out and he was on the front. And even though he went through all that, in his writings, all the time, right through, he loved the emperor. And he loved the empire, and he thought in many ways it was wonderful. And that's a very peculiar point of view when you really think about it. You would think he would sort of hate it, that Jews were mistreated, whatever, poor people and all that. But he wasn't, because he already saw the handwriting on the wall of what would happen later. And he has very interesting things to say about the Anschluss. This was a time where everybody wanted Anschluss in 1918. Most people were for it. The English and French wouldn't allow it. But he always said Anschluss would be terrible. It would just be what would happen. Poor Austria would just be submitted to German rule, and he was very much against it. But you never quite know when you're reading the book about these three generations of the von Tottas. How many of you do you know the novel? No, most people. Some. Many people know that.
Pretty well known in Poland.
Pretty well known, good. Because, when you have the first von Totta saving the emperor, this whole ridiculous thing about by sheer, and then you have the three generations, you would think that he's very, very critical of them. And he certainly is of Franz August, the second one, the very stilted one, the one who's the civil servant, and then the drunken son, the end of the whole thing. But it's interesting that the best friend of Franz August, the second, the civil servant, is the doctor in town with whom he plays chess, who is Jewish. And you think all the time, well, he himself is against everything. But that's his best friend, who's left at the end playing chess with himself because he has nobody to play with anymore. So you have to read it very carefully to see how this irony goes in all directions. So it's not the usual treatment that you have. I'm trying to think of a contrasting novel. I mean, it's not like All Quiet on the Western Front. Or, for instance, recently, because of there has been the celebration of the armistice of 1918, right? And so in all the English language newspapers, there have been articles about, were there good war poets? What they mean by war poets are only the British war poets, Wilfred Owen, Rupert Brooke, who aren't such great poets. They always are just talking about those poets as if nobody else existed. And yet you had poets like Apollinaire, Sandra, of course, who I always loved, and you had, and Celan, all these poets later on, who are in a way much more interesting because they saw all the different sides of war. And they didn't just say war is bad, which after a while gets to be a very boring theme, depending on how, and very sentimental. And you know very well that most, say, war movies, whether about World War I, World War II, whatever, the Vietnam War, they will always have the same affect in a way. And, this is awful and this is terrible, which, okay, we know that's true, but again, it's fairly obvious. So that these writers all were very equivocal in their point of view. Now, why was that? Partly it's because they all came, except for Krauss, but even Krauss's family came from from Moravia, Czechoslovakia, and he was certainly an outsider in a way. They were all outsiders. They weren't your typical Viennese at all. They were all outsider artists. Kennedy, who came from Bulgaria, whose Parents spoke German, had been at the book theater, had met at the book theater in Vienna, and spoke German as a kind of secret language, which he didn't know. Then his father got a job in London, so he learned English and had an English governess and so forth. Then his father died of a heart attack when he was 32 or so, and then the mother decided to move to Vienna, and he quickly had to learn German in about 3 weeks. It's amazing. And practically tortured him learning it. He never really felt at home there, and he never really felt at home anywhere. And that was true of Celan, certainly. Celan, after the war, lived in Vienna briefly. In post-war 1946 Vienna, really never liked it. Got along, moved to France, married a French aristocratic woman. I don't think that's wholly a coincidence, Gisèle Lesong. But he was never part of French culture because the French had no use for the Austrian poets, poets in the empire at all. He taught German at various, he was a tutor and taught German at various French schools, but he never really belonged anywhere. And so when you have a group of writers who doesn't belong, they see things that other people don't see. And I think that made them a really interesting group of writers, very unusual, in that way. That Musil, Canetti, Roth, they were all somewhat different, Krauss, yeah.
Not belonging.
Not really belonging, loving Austria in a way, loving the emperor's tomb, all this stuff. But as the people who really belonged didn't feel, didn't quite, but they didn't really belong. They weren't really part of it, and they knew that, but therefore they can see it and see both good sides and bad sides. And it's very amazing that for a long time, of course, I went back and looked at early reviews of Joseph Roth, where people didn't want to read him at all because they thought he was really a traitor. I mean, liking the emperor as being a traitor. You can't be in favor of that. Yeah.
Okay, so you started talking already about the content and the selection you've made, but there are quite a few things to be still discussed. Looking at the list of authors that you decided to talk about, I mean, Karl Kraus is an inevitable choice. So is Musil probably, and so is Roth in the gang, right? But the three other authors are not that obvious or not that inevitable. So you said a few words already about Celan, but I think he deserves a special attention. So maybe we can start from that point. But just for those who don't know the book, the three others are again Elias Canetti, but rather as the author of the memoir rather than say auto da fe, right? Perhaps this is the question now, right? Why this choice?
That's
right?
True.
Why did you choose to discuss him as the author of the memoir?
I think it was simply because when I read this memoir, which has 4 volumes and was written much later, it's true, they don't fit into the same scheme. When I read that memoir, and Auto da fe, his novel is amazing too, but perhaps more mainstream in some ways, not as interesting to me as the memoir, that the memoir has that same theme. It seemed so peculiar to me, this equivocal feeling about the Austro-Hungarian Empire, which he was always certainly somewhat of an outsider, but he felt also an insider. And they're the most wonderful passages in it. In this one, the first one, wonderful passages like the passage where he's a schoolboy in Vienna during the war. He was younger, during World War I, and he has a friend whose father is a general or something, and they walk to school together. And nobody's supposed to know Canetti's Jewish. I mean, he sort of hides that. And they see all these trains coming in with boxcars full of people, and he asked his friend, who are these people? And he said, they're people coming in from Galicia, from Eastern Europe, Poland, Galicia, whatever, in boxcars, you know, and it's very creepy in a way. It's very upsetting for him. And he just notices it, and he doesn't really want to stop and look and what's going to happen to these people. And then when you read it, again, the irony is you read it and you realize it's just another 20 years, those boxcars will be going in the other direction. And there's obviously a connection. And so I felt that Canetti was somebody who understood this mood very well. And the reason I did Salon, let's come to that. Wittgenstein may be a peculiar choice. I'll come back to that.
I'll ask you anyway.
Oh, okay. The reason I did Salon is I disliked so much the way Salon is usually talked about. Salon has been taken over by French theory a great deal. And Derrida wrote a famous piece called The Shibboleth, where he takes one line from Salon and he becomes the ultimate Holocaust poet. He signifies the Holocaust. And I used to believe this too, in a way. And it's very convenient, and as such, Salon is widely read in the West, you know, in various translations. And the same three poems are always read, Todesfuge and so forth. And the fact is that Salon is not such a typical Holocaust poet in the sense that he was already writing a lot of the poetry before, you know, he even knew what was going to happen. He was quite happy in some ways when war broke out because he could come back and go to be a poetry student. Instead of going to medical school, which his parents wanted, he could come back and study poetry in Bucharest. And for a while it was very safe because the Russians at that time were in control at the beginning of the war. The Russians were in control but weren't doing anything much yet. It was occupied by the Russians, but he and all his friends were going to school and reading Mallarmé and reading Baudelaire and being sort of aesthetes and writing love poetry, and he wrote a lot of love poetry. It was in the middle of a great affair. That's what I wrote about a lot, then the poetry to Ingeborg Bachmann, and that whole relationship, to show that in many ways Salon was a much broader poet. And again, if you just consider him a Jewish poet and was writing about the Holocaust, it's very limiting, because again, when he was a young boy, there's nothing he wanted as much as a Loden jacket for his birthday, everything from Vienna, and Vienna was the great good place. That was the place he longed for, and he didn't want to be, you know, so, I mean, he became a Holocaust poet, let's say, by default, but I think it's a very exaggerated view of him, and it is the going view, because Jean-Luc Nancy, Derrida, all of them write about him. Usually they write about the same three poems again and again, and nobody writes about this kind of other Salon. Now, there's a wonderful book of letters, that prompted me on that, between Salon and Ingeborg Bachmann. And they were lovers, and she was, of course, an amazing poet, too. And that's just an amazing, it should be made into a movie or something, their relationship. They met in Vienna, shortly after the war, and were just crazy about each other. And then he moves to France, but they're still, the relationship goes up and down and is then renewed when he was married to Giselle. And there's another Viennese woman, Austrian woman involved, who's written a whole book about it now, another affair. And so you get a very different image of Salon than you get in the usual view. And even in America, where we have Pierre Joris's translation, which is considered very, very good. There's Michael Hamburger. I don't think any of them quite do justice to it. And one point that interested me was they all say he invented his own language. And so Joris has a long passage, and Derrida talks about that Salon hated Germans so much that he had to invent his own language. And I asked various Austrian friends whether they thought that was true about individual words, terms. Now, those of you who know German, like weggebeizt, which is an engraving tool, really. I mean, to engrave in, to remove the engraving tool, the acid. But it's very close to weggebissen, which would be bitten away, right? And there's a poem that begins with that word. Well, it isn't really an inventing a language. It's just that the language is much more Austrian than German. So I got an Austrian dictionary. And if you look up a lot of words, you'll see that there's still a lot of words to this day that are very different in Austrian German if you get a dictionary. And And I asked people and sort of checked on that, and they said, no, the language isn't that difficult. But in English, it is a fact, and in French, that somehow or other, that he invented his own language. Well, you can say that in American, Emily Dickinson, people often say, invented, she has a kind of private language, but it isn't really. I mean, you can look up the words in the dictionary, they're compounds. So I felt that was a very exaggerated view, and so I did include Salon, although that's just eccentric. Let me say it's quite eccentric. I always do that when I do books. I do the people that interest me. I don't do the usual people. You notice, for instance, I don't talk about Stefan Zweig. That's partly because I don't like Stefan Zweig. I've never taught people I don't like either. I mean, you don't have to, Why do you have to? And the reason I don't like Stefan Zweig is I think he was something of a phony in that he was a very rich young man, and if you were rich enough in Vienna, you could pass. So he thought nobody knew he was Jewish. He passed. I had plenty of relatives like that. He was really an elegant, aristocratic Gentile. And so, of course, for him, it was especially awful that from Hitler's point of view, he was just another Jew. He had to leave. He came to the United States. He never was really short of money so much. And then he went to Brazil, and I've seen in Brazil, I've been to Brazil various times, where he died, he committed suicide. And now Stefan Zweig is very in, and they use him as a kind of representative of this period. And I think that's very fake, because I don't think he represents what really went on at all, which these others represent. You see what I mean?
Yeah, but this is a great moment. I think I do, but I would need a word from you about this. What you spoke about his biography or biographical position, but what would make him as a writer different from the bunch? What would make him not really a participant or part of this Austrian
I don't think he really understood what happened. He thought, as many people did, that Hitler's just an aberration, that Hitler came along and happened to get elected. Isn't that terrible? And so Nazism, Thomas Mann had exactly the same view. Nazism is just a brief period, and we just have to get over it, but basically Germany, Austria, it's really, great country and all that. In other words, Stefan Zweig would have been very happy to remain in Austria if he possibly could have. He wasn't critical. It wasn't that he was critical of the political situation or really understood it. And I know that because there's a big correspondence between Joseph Roth and Stefan Zweig. They were very good friends. And so Joseph Roth will write to Zweig and warn him and say, you better leave, and this is what's going on, and this is what's going to happen. It's just a matter of time, by 1935 or so, earlier. And Zweig doesn't understand really at all. His autobiography is interesting, and I quote it, where he describes how hard it was to get back to his family place in Salzburg, and how bad the trains were, and how everything was falling apart, and all that. But mostly Zweig's own fiction or love stories, nice, witty and sort of, quite charming love stories. I don't know. It's partly my own upbringing. My family always used to say, Zweig ist ein bisschen ein Schmuck. I mean, he isn't really a great writer. I mean, the other writers, Hermann Bach, there are lots of other writers. One could talk about I Do Love Schnitz and so forth. But I just think this cult of Zweig right now in the United States is like the cult, what can I say, of Sachertorte. I mean, it's very nice, It's nice, But I don't really feel that he is,
This is I think this negative example here is very important because it somehow helps us, I think, better understand better how not nice the writers you're writing about are, right? That you don't want to write about too nice people, right? Too nice.
Well, I wouldn't say Zweig was so nice. Yeah. Nice is not the word. I mean, he was quite content. Look, Adorno, everybody in the United States, there's such an Adorno cult. Adorno, his real name is Wiesengrund, was Theodor Wiesengrund, was his father, was a wealthy Jewish wine merchant. His mother was not Jewish, and he would have done anything to stay in Germany. He was already a professor in Germany. If the Nazis would have let him stay, I assure you he would have stayed. It isn't that he wanted to leave. He was a little anti-Semitic themselves. You always have to understand that most of these people were themselves anti-Semitic. Roth was too. They all were somewhat anti-Semitic because they knew it was very hard to be Jewish and it would be very nice to convert. Certainly Wittgenstein, who we'll get to in a minute, wrote various anti-Semitic things about the Jews, Weiniger. I mean, this is a complicated problem, but it's very understandable. But it's more interesting, to me, it's much more interesting than somebody like Stefan Zweig, who really had no thoughts about it at all. He was just very happy. He was part of a rich family and could lead an elegant life and could be a well-known writer and admired by everybody and reviewed in the newspapers and very popular. But that's not really very remarkable in some ways. And I say he wasn't widely read. He's widely read right now. I don't know how long that will last because there was that movie Hotel Book. Yeah. Budapest. Hotel. What is it called?
Grand Budapest Hotel.
The Grand Budapest Hotel.
Yeah, which is nice.
It's a little, yeah.
Yeah, I mean, what I meant, nice was your word, is the lack of, if I got you right, that the essential quality of the writers you're looking at is this. Well, it's precisely the title of your book. And the biting irony, right?
Irony, complexity, difficulty, something to really think about. That anybody can always write a criticism of whatever it is, or it's not very interesting in some ways, but. They're writers who are very interesting. I'll give you an example. I just saw a film that I just got the other day that's going to be on television that a man I know in Los Angeles made named Pierre Sauvage, who was born in New York, but his parents came from France where they were hidden by Huguenots in a Huguenot village in France. And this film is all about how wonderful these Huguenots were. They themselves had been persecuted. And so they saved 5,000 Jews, and it's a very touching story. So it is, in a way, very moving, and his explanation is they had been persecuted, so they were very good to the Jews. But finally, it's sentimental, and it doesn't tell you very much, because right next door, I'm sure there were other villages where the opposite happened, and people were collaborators, and you know that from the film, which has been on television, wonderful, the serial Un Village Français, which is very different. So when you get these straightforward views, you feel they're skirting a lot of the complexity. And that, for instance, from an American point of view, Americans can never understand how many of these Jewish writers were themselves somewhat anti-Semitic. Because in America, that's considered terrible. And how can that be? But that's because Americans have never gone through anything. They've never been persecuted, really. I mean, maybe they couldn't belong to a certain country club or whatever, but in fact, nothing has happened to them. So I know this from my own grandchildren or even children, especially if you grow up in California. Nothing is going to, or in New York, whatever, you don't notice anything. And so they may read in the newspaper that there's now anti-Semitism again or whatever, but it has never really touched them. So they don't understand that. But as Joseph Roth said, every Jew who had come to Vienna and made good and maybe owned a department store had relatives back in Katowice that he didn't want to acknowledge, but they were his relatives. And that's a very tricky problem. And then they're embarrassed about it or ashamed of it, or they want to be like everybody else. So most of the Jews, of course, became Protestant, the ones who were converted, became Protestant, not Catholic. My grandfather, who was in the Austrian ministry, one of the only Jews, or maybe the only one early on who was in the ministry, regularly had his superior come to him and say, wouldn't you please do us the favor, Herr Minister, of making the Karriertaufe, the career baptism. That was the word, die Karriertaufe. You become baptized to save your career, for the sake of your career. And since he didn't, my grandmother was never invited to anything. She was never invited to the balls or the formal things because, of course, you could have him, okay, but you couldn't have her, really. So that's what it was like. The result was that you had plenty of people who themselves wished, of course they wished they weren't Jewish, and there was a good deal of anti-Semitism. Let's say Kennedy himself had very mixed feelings, depending of who he was with, how he counted. And Krauss also, has been criticized for anti-Semitism, was Catholic, was baptized, and so forth. So it's a very complicated thing. But Celan, who they now make the perfect Holocaust poet, if you read Salon's poems carefully, there are many poems about churches or taking place in churches or about baptism or about grace that also show he had a great attraction to this.
Well, just before we leave Salon, I mean, I'm very happy that you included him, and I'm very happy that you're shifting the focus and you're looking at his love poetry, indeed. But and indeed, you quote this the line from his notes to the Meridian speech, where he says, "I'm actually a sort of posthumous son of the Austro-Hungarian Empire," which legitimizes the choice. But can we say that there is? Can we locate irony in the poems of Celan that you're reading?
I think so. I myself can't figure some of them out at all, because the irony is so biting. Because just when you think. There are a number I discussed that we could talk about, but just when you think that he's writing, there's one poem, for instance, where he enters a church, clearly with his beloved. I think that was already Giselle. And he's kind of critical of, he looks at the confessional and the priest and so forth, but there also has a sense of longing for it. And so I do think it is similar.
So there is a play, ironic play with his own
absolutely.
Longing.
It isn't just always that I think the Holocaust, and even yes, in an early poem like Todesfuge, but Celan rejected Todesfuge. He didn't want everybody to always only read Todesfuge, like that, because he said it's a poem of my youth. I would now, which is fairly straightforward in that way. And I think many of his poems describe a sense of longing and being lost and not belonging, and why that is. And I mean, there's no solution to this problem. Now, can we talk about Wittgenstein a little bit?
Yes, yeah. Definitely.
Well, okay. I had to include Wittgenstein because I love Wittgenstein. He's my hero, kind of, So I would, but actually Wittgenstein in many ways gave me the idea. Wittgenstein is a different kind of outsider. He was born in Vienna. To this fabulously wealthy family. But of course, he was a Jew, although that was denied by the family in many ways. They were brought up as Catholics. Somebody came and they studied the catechism. And Wittgenstein, later, I have that in the book, how he loved the Gospels and he loved Christianity. And he's very ambivalent about it. In the early 30s, when anti-Semitism became so big, he does recognize, of course, that he's a Jew, but he's very critical. He was a good example of, in many ways, at least at the beginning, of being an anti-Semitic Jew and wondering whether Mendelssohn can be as great as Brahms or whatever, being Jewish. I mean, it's sort of terrifying, really, in some ways. But he was very honest with himself and realized he had this problem. But what's interesting is, that I found so interesting in this instance, I mean, Wittgenstein is a fascinating person because he was as hard on himself as on anybody else, and he always tried to figure out what you can't say or when you're being dishonest and what the things are. And he had very ambivalent feelings about Austria. He got as far away as he could living in England and being at Cambridge, and hated to come back even at Christmas, which I think had largely to do with his family and that he was gay, and that it was very uncomfortable for him being at home with all those sisters and bugging him all the time and trying to introduce him to different women and so forth, which didn't quite work. That was part of it. But on the other hand, he, after all, fought in World War I on the German side, and he later said, the war made it possible for me to write the Tractatus. Before that, I really couldn't do it. Now, if you've never read the Tractatus, it's so incredibly moving because you have those first 4 sections that are on logic and mathematics. I don't really understand it all, but I understand some of the basic parameters where you deal with tautologies and what can be said. And everything you say can only be a tautology, really, that can be said. It is either raining or it's not raining. You can't say most things. Suddenly the whole thing breaks off. And he comes to all these ethical principles, and you get these wonderful aphorisms like, the sense of the world must be outside the world. It can't have a sense inside the world. Or everything we see could always be otherwise. Or, the world of the happy is a happy world, which is one I love. I don't know why. It's ridiculous, isn't it? It's like childish. The world of the happy. Die Welt der Glücklichen ist eine glückliche Welt. Well, what does that really mean? I mean, of course, but when you see how he relates all those things and how the things that you can't say, which later get developed in books like Uncertainty, it's just endlessly fascinating. And I felt he very much belonged in this book, not so much because he himself, and it's only an epilogue, a coda, is so ironic, but because he also refuses to let people make wrong generalizations. So I think he's a very important person to understand politics, both at his own time and today, because you can't say these ridiculous things. I always think of Wittgenstein when people talk about, say, the American dream. Are we realizing the American dream? It's ridiculous. Well, what is what does that really mean? It's more like a nightmare in some ways. Or you have the idea, the dream from which, you've woken up, or whatever it is. But here's the thing, for instance, that you hear on the news every day. When we discuss immigration in the United States, every day you hear them say, well, America has always been the country of immigrants. This kind of generalization. Wittgenstein wouldn't let people make those generalizations. He would ask, what does that really mean? Explain that sentence. To whom is it true? And the fact is that hasn't been true in the United States at all. In the 1930s, when Roosevelt was president, when I came to the United States, most people were not let in, and they were very hard on immigrants. And there have been other periods where they've been very hard, harder than now, on immigrants. So these are just truisms that people say that aren't so. And Wittgenstein's is a kind of negative theology that he forces you to say, when you say that, what do you mean by the word blue? Or what do you mean by the word happy? Glücklich. And so once you learn that, it's a methodology, not a sense of truth. So that he fits in with these other authors. And Karl Kraus, they were all related in some way. By the way, they were all actually related. Karl Kraus is a third cousin of Wittgenstein's and of Hayek's and so forth. They're all related because they had these huge families. They were all one of 12 children or something. So the relationships are very great there. And although, for instance, Friedrich Hayek was not Jewish, he wrote a little biography of Wittgenstein that's now being published, that he wrote at the time. It's very interesting, and he knew him slightly, and they all kind of knew each other. But Wittgenstein also stands as an outsider of this Austrian world that in a way he loved. And he said the English, in World War I, he said, the English will win the war and should win the war because they are better people, a better race. He uses the word race, which is kind of scary. But I don't know where that leaves me because I am German through and through. So, but the English will win. They probably should win. So there are always these ambivalent feelings, and that get very complex about how to feel about his heritage. But on the other hand, he loved Goethe, he loved the writers, and he knew them inside out. And with Wittgenstein is that he teaches you how to use language, and for me that has always been a crucial thing, that there's nobody who helps you to understand. For instance, if you read Stefan Zweig and did a Wittgensteinian careful reading, you would see how some of the things work out. Okay. Does that make any sense? No.
It makes total sense to me. Okay, so the question would be then, you said a few words about authors that you might have included, but you didn't for some reasons, and authors, more contemporary writers that you see as continuing the traditions. Do you want to say a word more about that?
Well, I could have, for instance, in terms of women, one reviewer said, in fact, Edward Tim said this, it's often, of course, people criticize me for that I have all these men and no women. I could have, I suppose, included Nellie Sachs. There's certain women writers, Eichinger maybe. I could have included, and Bachmann himself, but she comes later. But the women come really late, a little bit later. So I didn't feel there was anybody who quite fit the bill. And I thought, okay, I don't include most men either. You know, as I say, I didn't dare include Kafka, because if I had, I mean, the literature on Kafka is so vast, and there's so many issues, but Kafka would be certainly the epitome of this kind of writer, and I also felt people would understand him better if they realized he is a creature of the empire. Not so to call him a Czech writer, whatever that means, or to call him a Jewish writer, and it's not really very accurate. And Kafka, too, had very ambivalent feelings about being Jewish. And is certainly that kind of writer. Now, as far as the later writers go, I may do more, but I felt that was enough, and I felt that really then is a later period. And although, of course, Celan is also partly post-war, partly war, post-war, was born in 1920, somebody like Bernhard is already really later. It's a different world. And that world is different. Actually, and there is some very good writing on that. Interestingly, Bernhard is popular in the United States, or more popular. These writers are somewhat. Maybe they are more understandable than the early ones, and you would understand that better than I. Why, probably? No?
In the States, I don't know.
I don't know. But anyway, sure, you could always do other writers, and I wanted to do a play, a novel, poetry, a memoir. So I have, and then the Musil novel, which is really more a set of essays. Musil's fiction is not very fictional in terms of characters being developed, real people. It is an essayistic novel, so I felt I covered different genres. I did want to cover as many different genres as I could. And that's why I took Canetti as a memoirist, not so much as a fiction writer, although then I reread Auto da Fe, which is such a fascinating novel. But it's in some ways more conventional than the memoirs, I think. And it's interesting, after all this, after these writers, if you do reread Thomas Mann, which I did recently because we had a big event just now in Los Angeles, where a book has been published that I hope some of you will see, which is called The Dr. Faustus Dossier. Be a great book to have translated maybe, which is done by Schoenberg's grandson, Randy Schoenberg. He put it together. It's just diaries, letters, and some speeches, and it's the fight between Thomas Mann, Adorno, and Schoenberg when they were all living in Los Angeles during the war in my neighborhood, Pacific Palisades. That's why it interested me, right down the street. And they're having a Mann house now, has been turned into a museum on San Remo Drive in Pacific Palisades. And there's a book called Weimar on the Pacific about many of these writers, because there were so many filmmakers, refugees, there was Franz Werfel, so on. The fight is fascinating because Thomas Mann was the kind of emperor. Thomas Mann didn't even need a visa, I think, to come to the United States because he was the Nobel Prize winner, and he came to Princeton, and everybody revered him, and he was waited on by his wife and various servants hand and foot, and in his comments it's always which wine was good enough and what coffee was good enough. He has very little to say about the war. Schoenberg was a very different case, poor, and first fled Austria for Germany and came from the Leopoldstadt, and was obviously Jewish, although he had also converted to Catholicism. And Mann looked down sort of on Schoenberg. And Adorno is the third member, who was younger. And when Mann was writing Dr. Faustus, he based it on Schoenberg, which is very insulting because the main character has syphilis, suffering from syphilis, and the argument of the novel is really that the 12-tone music system was the paradigm for fascism, and which is a complicated theory, but kind of ridiculous. And anyway, Adorno wrote all the chapters on music because Mann didn't know enough about music. So he had Adorno write the chapter about 12-tone music, but also about Wagner, about other composers. Beethoven, there's a whole chapter on Beethoven and so forth. And Adorno wrote those, but that's not known. But anyway, when Schoenberg found out that Mann had written this, he went right to the Brentwood Mart, which is right in my neighborhood, the Brentwood Shopping Center, and had a lunch with Alma Mahler and told her how furious he was and that he was going to sue Thomas Mann. Can you imagine? So there was this lawsuit that went on, which is really vicious and nasty. And as a result, Thomas Mann added a little postscript on the last page of Dr. Faustus, where it says, in fact, chapter 22, I think, which is on the 12-tone system, is taken from a music theorist, a music theorist and composer named Arnold Schoenberg. Well, when Schoenberg saw that, he was even angrier. A music theorist. And he said, we'll see later on who's considered a composer and a writer. Well, I have to say, most of my friends now feel that Dr. Faustus is not even readable. It seems so contrived, and everything is demonic already early in the book, and it doesn't really seem as if the 12-tone system is a good model for fascism. So it certainly isn't as popular as it was. I'm not sure how popular Schoenberg is either, but it's very interesting to go back and read Mann or even the Buddenbrooks and so forth, which in many cases may seem more dated now, I think, and were so famous. And partly it is the whole treatment where Mann, even in the speeches that are reprinted here, will say things like, he has one speech defending the Jews, and the defense is like some of my best friends. You know, Einstein was a Jew. So-and-so was a Jew. But he doesn't really have anything to say about the politics, and he basically is still saying that Germany is the great culture. There's no question that Germany is the country of Kant, of Hegel, of the great composers, and that's it. And when Nazism is over, it will once again be the great culture. And Adorno certainly believed this too, and went back to Frankfurt and thought you can just start over again and have the Frankfurt School. And you all know, I think, what happened to Adorno when then the real radicals came along and questioned him. And a girl came up to the front of the room when he was teaching, this is 1968, and bared her breasts and said, how do you like this, professor? And so on. And he then died of a heart attack, I think, a few days later. I mean, it's really a terrible story in a way. But he thought that Germany was still the good, Germany, and maybe Marxism would now prevail, or at least one could teach this Marxist reading in the Frankfurt School. And of course, Germany had changed tremendously too, and that didn't really happen. So I think it's interesting that, by the way, Celan, Adorno admired Celan somewhat, but Celan did not want to have anything much to do with him, and says that very critically. I say that in the book, just in the footnote, and he said Wiesengrund. He always calls him Wiesengrund. And Thomas Mann called him Wiesengrund too. And Schoenberg virtually hated him, although the young Adorno had written in praise of Schoenberg's music. Schoenberg said, I don't want to see him and his oily smile and everything. I don't want to have anything. He wouldn't speak to him in the years in Los Angeles. So this is all very interesting, and maybe this book will be made available. It's from the California Press. I don't know how interested people would be in it here, but it's really a very interesting story. And we've had some seminars on it in Los Angeles. I think a lot of these documents were known, but it wasn't available in English. Some of it was available in German. Anyway, that's just sort of a post note.
But it leads towards my last question before we ask people if they have any questions. I think you were heading towards answering my question, which is you seem to be suggesting that some of the things that were Mann was mentioned, that were seen as big are maybe somehow dated. And so the question is, what's the relevance, or what's the how not dated are the writers you're discussing, right?
Well,
what's the relevance of the book today?
Well, I think, I hope.
How much alive Austro-modernism is today, right?
Well, I hope it can be, and I've been led to believe at lunch today, for instance, that here many of these writers are popular, are read, at least they're
Indeed.
Because they do show the complexity and the difficulty. Of course, nobody was more anti-war than Krauss. I'm not looking for people who are going to praise war, but he understood how it comes about in the complexity, and that people don't become saints. Often treatments of war, especially in films, especially American films about World War II, everybody's virtuous. The Nazis are, it's like cowboys and I mean, everybody is virtuous on the American side, or the Allied side, and all the others are the enemy in that way. And that's not quite accurate either, and it gets very limited in some ways. So for instance, in Karl Kraus, and I know people have really responded to this, there's a letter which was based on a real letter by a woman to a soldier she thought had died, the Austrian peasant woman, Lieber Franz. lieber Franz, she thought he had died, and it turns out he hadn't. Meanwhile, she's taken up with somebody else, and she's pregnant with the other one's child. But she said, oh, she knows this one has more money because he's gotten some money now being in the army. And she said, maybe we could get together again. And after all, maybe the child won't live. Nice thing to say, you know, maybe they'll die. I mean, it's really kind of a vicious and terrible letter. And so at first you read it and you think this is really awful, but it's against the whole thing of, oh, all the peasants were wonderful, all good people, you know, and have the right attitudes, and it's just somehow the government that corrupts them. So I think Krauss is, and people have said to me, it's very relevant today. There have been performances of Last Days of Mankind in New Zealand. They did a great thing on it. And there have been performances in France, it's quite popular. And in England, I have a friend who did a radio, you can see it on, or hear it rather, on radio performance. And I think there are going to be more video performances now. That's one thing. Joseph Roth, I think, yeah, is more read now than he was. And so the views, look, the Thomas Mann views were always basically that ideas, such great novels of ideas like The Magic Mountain, but the ideas are always large philosophical ideas which are based on the premise that Germany is a great culture and that culture is everything. And as I say in my memoir, in the Vienna Paradox, if you have to choose between, if I have to choose, I should say, between culture and Kultur, and democracy, I would choose democracy. Because it's all very nice, culture is all very nice, but democracy is really more important in a way. And you can, you know, there's always that argument because democracy is in a way very anti-cultural. You know, it doesn't want to have high culture and it opposes that, and that's a huge problem. But having lived through that and having all these relatives myself who swore by culture, and if the culture is great, you know, the other doesn't matter so much. And just one final note on that. One of the things that these writers point out, that Roth points out, who after all worked as a correspondent for newspapers all his life, so he knew about politics. One of the things that shocked me about Thomas Mann, and about, for that matter, about Adorno and even Walter Benjamin, is none of them have anything to do with day-to-day politics. And I think that's one of the reasons that Hitler prevailed, that they never talk about politics is for ordinary people maybe, but the intellectuals don't deal with politics. They don't deal with grassroots politics or elections, day-to-day elections, local elections. And I'm always somebody who's believed it's very important to pay attention to your local elections, who gets elected. It does matter. And I think actually, of course, we all admired Poland very much when you had the Lech Walesa and Solidarity and so forth, that it's possible to have that. And so this notion that you get when you read Dr. Faustus, that for instance, in Dr. Faustus, there are chapters about after World War I and what Germany was like. And there's never a discussion of what, though, it was like for poor people or people who had one arm or who were wounded or anything. Now, of course, there were some German books that did, like Berlin Alexanderplatz, many. But on the whole, for these people, and Adorno too, it's always a question of ideas, of philosophy, of Marxism versus capitalism, but it never deals with day-to-day politics. And I think as an American, I'm very attuned to that. We do believe, however bad politics may be right now, hope it'll get better, that you have to be political in a sense. You have to care. You can't live in a realm of ideas and philosophy and sit around discussing Hegel or whatever, which Adorno, in these years in the 30s, if you read the correspondence between Benjamin and Adorno in the 1930s, I just was horrified, and I love Benjamin really, but I was horrified by that correspondence, because whatever is happening every day, they never mention it. It's what did you think of, I don't know, they're all studying, who's the great film critic? I'm just a blank. What?
Krakauer? Or?
Krakow. They're busy discussing Krakauer. What do you think about this by Krakauer? Meanwhile, the most awful things are happening in local elections. And that's something to watch for, what happens in local elections. And nobody is above politics, so it's not that I do that much myself, but I'm very happy, for instance, that my son-in-law, people go out and actually canvass in politics, you know, do things, are active, because I think that was, to me, one of the great problems in Germany was this idea that the intellectuals were completely cut off from day-to-day politics. Now, and that was probably true for many people in Austria too, in that sense. For somebody like Stefan Zweig, you see, they had nothing to do with politics. It wasn't good politics, bad politics. Politics is something that only lower class people, I mean, other people indulge in, but you don't deal with politics. That's not intellectual enough. And that's, I think, a very bad idea.
Well, thanks. It seems that poor Stefan became the black sheep of the
I didn't mean to do that.
of the conversation, but well.
You want to defend him? Yeah.
No, I not exactly, but maybe somebody from the audience. So,
I'm sure there are lots of questions.
Does anybody want to defend Stefan Zweig or
or anything,
or ask a question
I'm very
or
opinionated.
make a comment? You're welcome to.
I'm sure someone has a question.
Maybe a relative of Stefan Zweig.
Or publisher.
Do you publish him?
No. There is another one in Poland.
Oh, here's a hand, yeah. Question?
So I wanted to ask you, how do you use the word irony when you're referring to modernist writers? Is it different from the way that postmodernism in general uses the word irony?
No, not really different so much, except it's more cynicism in a way. Then, I mean, irony can be, you can have playful irony that's rather mild. You can have parody. You know, there's so many forms that irony can take. Parody, pastiche, satire. But that's an interesting thing. It is postmodern in a way because it's not satire. Satire has a particular object and a particular point of view. In many of these novels and writings, you don't quite know what the point of view is. Whose side is the writer on? That's certainly true in Krauss in a way. Whose side is the writer on? And it's certainly true in Joseph Roth. You're not so sure whose side it's on. And that would be a postmodern characteristic in many ways. Except, you know, as time goes on, I think that we used to think of postmodernism, I did too, always as a kind of separate movement. And there were all those charts by Ihab Hassan and others, modernism does this, postmodern does that. As more time goes on, I think we're still in an age of modernism. I don't think it's changed that much. So that would be my answer in a way, that I don't use the term postmodern much anymore, because as more time has gone on, we can see that some of the things that seem to be so different from modernism are really not that different. That's certainly true of the poetry, and I think.
Can I have a follow-up question?
And I know it's a long time ago, you know. So you think, well, how can it be 100 years old? Well, of course, there are also big differences, and the technology has made it very different. But it's more a continuity. I think the sharp break in literature comes with modernism, with the avant-garde. It's really a break. And the break now is not that great. When I see the things, you can see it more easily in the visual arts. But when I see things that people do in the visual arts that are supposed to be so new, Duchamp had done them all in 1915, you know, many of these things. And so they don't seem that new to me. And so I feel that now there's more continuity than there is difference, which is not a bad thing, but it's different. It's not as sharp a change.
Can I have a follow-up?
Sure.
To that? I really agree with you that I think the same way, that we are still in the modernism phase. So what should we do with postmodernism?
What should we do about the literature we called postmodern? Well, try and see, for instance, I feel I made a lot of mistakes in my book, Poetics of Indeterminacy, where I argued very much putting Ashbery in an anti-symbolist position, said how different he was from T.S. Eliot. I've since really changed my mind. Eliot is such a great poet, and if you read Eliot now, from a point of view, you can see he already did a lot of the things, and Ashbery even said to me he was very much influenced by Eliot, you see? So that we don't have to make these sharp divisions. Of course, everybody wants to defend what they're doing by saying it's new, making it new. On the other hand, we have a very strange situation in the United States now, where we've gone back to a kind of realism which is pre-modern in many ways, because race is such a big issue, and many of the novels by Black authors, they would say so themselves, are really influenced by 19th century writers or really earlier writers. Now, do you know at all the work of Virginia Jackson? Virginia Jackson, she writes on the lyric. Peter, no? Okay, her argument, you would like, is that when she takes Black authors like Claudia Rankin, Terence Hayes, that they're in the Longfellow tradition. Now, if you believe that Longfellow's a great poet, then I suppose they're in the Longfellow tradition. I'm too much of a modernist. I can't get excited about Longfellow. I don't even know if you people know Longfellow, but we used to have to memorize it when I went to school. Hiawatha, by the shores of Gitchigumi, by the shining deep sea water. Or, you know, these tell me not in mournful numbers, life is but an angry dream. Piotr, no? Did you never study Longfellow?
I guess we did.
It didn't make much impact on you. You see what I mean? No, here you have your contemporary poet, not. So this is the kind of argument you're getting now, and I just despair when I read it. I mean, I can't really deal with it, because I think much of this, in other words, it's just realistic writing. It's sort of polemic, political polemic, whatever polemic, straightforward lyric poetry. Now, the argument for that is, well, our voices haven't been heard, so we can't afford to have these complicated forms. We're just going to write straightforward lyric poetry about our feelings. Well, we can argue that, yes or no. It'll take its course in certain ways. But this is the mood now. This is the mood right now. It's not postmodern either. They don't talk about postmodernism much. I noticed that Frederick Jameson, who wrote so many great things about postmodernism, I noticed his most recent book, or one of his most recent book, is called 8 Great Modernists, and he has a chapter on Mann and a chapter on Kafka. These are somewhat earlier essays, but has gone back to that a lot too. So that people come back to modernism because it's still so amazing, because we still haven't properly understood modernism. Perhaps that's the answer. That especially, for instance, the Russians, to me, the great avant-garde was the Russian avant-garde. And I guess Poland in some ways goes with that. I do think that Klebnikov, these amazing poems by Klebnikov, which I write about have a chapter in my book, 21st Century Modernism, and the art, Malevich to me is the great modernist painter, has not been surpassed by anybody. You know, it's not that it's dated or anything, and it was in a way very much ahead of its time. And it wasn't widely known in America or in England because it was, of course, known in Poland, I guess, because of the language barrier and all that. And it's still not, because the art historians, you know, many things you have to try to understand how they're known. Art historians, almost none of them knew Russian, ever studied Russian. So they couldn't really deal with the Russian avant-garde, just as they couldn't deal with, say, Polish avant-garde. They can't, because it's a language problem. And they all learn French. This is changing now to some extent, but it's not changing in a positive direction for, say, a country like Poland, because they're not going to study Polish, they're going to study Arabic, maybe, right? Or Chinese, as these countries become so powerful. So that, you know, there's a kind of stance, and if you have to read everything in translation, it works for certain things and not others, so that you have a writer like Orhan Pamuk. Well, you have certain Polish things that are popular. You've had plenty of Polish poets who are popular in the United States. Well, Pietro could talk about more than I, right? But they're only known partially. The woman, the Nobel Prize winner, of course, and so on. But I don't know that people actually know the work. They sort of pay lip service to it, but they don't know the work, and they only know it in translation, which is often not knowing very much. It's tricky for me. There's a Polish poet I admire who sends me all this work, who's Gregor... What? Yeah, and who's translated into English, and so then I can read it in English, and he lives in Sweden, but then I wonder what... Denmark, I'm sorry. See, then in Denmark, but I wonder what I'm really reading. Is it the translator I really admire? I don't know. You know, it's tricky, but it was interesting, yeah.
It's Wróblewski.
Yeah. What?
It's Wróblewski you're reading because it's a good translation.
It is, yeah, I thought it's a very good translation. And of course, I can't read ones that aren't, yeah, yeah. Yeah, it's a very interesting poet, very dark, yeah. But anyway, other questions?
Yes.
I don't know, what would you do with postmodernism? I don't know.
I'm struggling.
But look, they used to call novelists postmodern, like Philip Roth. I mean, they're really a kind of throwback in some ways, much easier to read than other. Saul Bellow, Updike, do we call those, John Barth, do we call those postmodern? I don't know.
I really wanted to go back to modernism, but everybody was telling me, stop it.
I know, well, just say it's I don't know, give it another name.
Yeah.
You know, there are other names. But I remember I grew up when they had these, Ihab Hassan had all these charts where he would say, modernism is the city, postmodernism is the global village, okay? Modernism, Yurik Kutnik is here who studied, did you study with Ihab? Is Yurik here? Didn't you study those charts? Yeah. Did you believe them? Yeah, you wrote a book on postmodernism.
Yeah. In those days I did.
Well, how do you feel about it now? How do you feel about it? Now, Yurik Kutnik wrote a book, that's how I got to know him, on Raymond Federman and Ronald Sukenik, two American novelists. And wasn't it called The Postmodernism of...
No, it was called The Novel as Performance.
Oh.
But I consider performance a nice metaphor for postmodern sensibility, the way I defined it.
And didn't you study at Milwaukee where they did all that postmodernism?
Yeah.
So they had all those charts of modernism is centered, postmodernism is decentered.
You know,
Okay.
it was useful. It was useful.
It
in
was
those
useful.
days.
It was useful, but modernism wasn't also centered. You see, so then it would be modernism is symbolism, postmodernism more literal, maybe more allegorical. It was useful. I remember, you know, in New York, but we did all that, and you wanted it to be something different. So John Cage, is that modern, postmodern?
Both.
Both. Okay.
In between.
That's it. You see?
But you know, it was interesting because when I studied Federman, he was a very postmodern writer for me. What is interesting today, if anybody is interested in Federman still, he's a Holocaust writer.
Yes.
More than a postmodern writer these days.
And by the way, he came out of Beckett. We haven't mentioned Beckett, Samuel Beckett. Beckett used to be called a postmodern writer because, of course, it was, as far as historical time period goes, after the war, and very different again, and a great writer, and there's your great postmodern, probably considered the great postmodern writer. But as we look at Beckett now, as different as the unnameable is from James Joyce and so on, it's still the basic sensibility or the basic feelings can still be quite modern. There used to be great attempts to call Gertrude Stein a postmodern writer because she's so difficult and all that. I don't think so. There's a whole book called The Postmodernism of Gertrude Stein. I don't think so, though, because she had one great modern belief, which is that writers are really important, and Beckett had that belief. Writers really matter, and that the writers are, in a way, the oracles of the time, in a way, and that great writers, there is such a thing as being a great writer, and you want to be a great writer. That's certainly not the view today. Today, it's sort of the view, you know, who's to say who the great writers are? We have all kinds of writers, and you go with your community. If you're an Asian American, you read Asian American writers, Native American, whatever. Nobody's worrying whether they're great in that way. You can't really talk about it. So that's a real break in a certain sense today. But then again, people don't really believe it. The people who write on Toni Morrison think she is great somehow, you know, otherwise they wouldn't bother. But you're not allowed to say that. You're not allowed to say any artist is great. Or if you're a writer, you're not allowed to say, I will sacrifice, or somebody like Kafka, or many of the writers, I will sacrifice life for art. Art is separate from life, and art is more important than everyday life. No, that's considered snobbish and bad and so forth. So that that's an interesting question. As we get further away from Beckett, he will be considered a late modernist. He's already now considered, people will say Beckett is a late modernist, whatever that is. But it's not sort of considered a difference. And then when you have poets like John Ashbery, great American poet like John Ashbery, nobody would really quite postmodern. No, because he doesn't fit in with some of these other things. And his influences are the high romantic writers and earlier writers and modernist poets and so forth, Wallace Stevens. So nobody knows what to do with permanent, but you're not supposed to talk about that anyway. You don't talk about periods anymore.
When domesticated, postmodernism becomes late modernism.
Becomes a sort of, right, that's right.
Okay, so thanks. Are there any more questions, comments?
Yes, here's one.
Dutch move?
I would like to ask a question about if you intended an influence of this book when you were visiting a place that has been under in this division of not in the Austro-Hungarian Empire but the Russian Empire, and the vision of this book is very interesting in terms of Europe, European in the European context, as now has a lot of discussion has been made about the potential of Austrian literature, and you make this.
I'm thrilled to hear that.
Make it very much broader. So it seems to me that it's a big potential.
Well, I'm thrilled to hear that.
Have you been intending that? And
I would intend it, but I didn't believe it. Most of my friends at home, most of my poetry friends, haven't even looked at it. My poetry friends, who are my good friends, people like Charles Bernstein, the various poets, they haven't read it because they don't know any of the authors. Maybe some of them have read it, and they don't know anything about. I mean, you can't believe it. I mean, that is a terrible thing in the United States in some ways. I had a close colleague at Stanford, Al Jelby, good friend, who writes on American poetry, and he said to me, he actually said to me, I didn't know Austria was in World War I. I thought it was just Germany. I mean, this kind of thing, this is what Americans believe. And I started to say before, and I didn't finish that, right now for the armistice, I feel I'm going to write a letter to the editor, I think. All the newspapers have written about the armistice of 1918. You would never know there was an Austro-Hungarian Empire. You know, it's just, again, Germany versus England, with the United States coming in late and saving the day. Germany, I should say, against England and France. They do know France was in the war. Okay, they've completely forgotten. And one of the reasons I did write the book, and that's why I'm very happy that there is this reaction in Europe, is I felt the people who had suffered most from World War I were the Austro-Hungarian Empire, not Germany, not France, because France and England, of course, had so many deaths and so many wounded, but the country was not basically dismantled. If you look on the map, the French map, all right, Alsace-Lorraine may have changed hands slightly, and in Germany too, Gdansk, Danzig, these things changed slightly, but Austria-Hungary just didn't exist anymore. And the fact that from one day to the next, this country was completely lost. And my grandfather writes about this, and the day after the armistice, the Czechs didn't know whether they should be in the Austrian government or not. Then they were sent back to Czechoslovakia, and the next thing you know, the Czechs wouldn't deliver fuel to the Austrians. And the same thing with Yugoslavia, of course. And so this was a terrible break, a really, you know, almost unimaginable change that this could happen, and nobody understood it. And Woodrow Wilson, we now think of Woodrow Wilson as very guilty in parceling these countries out. This will be this will be that, this will be, you know, Serbia will become this will become Yugoslavia. Think of how terrible that was, really, that, and then turn the countries against each other in a way. So I think it's wonderful that this is happening in Europe now, but I'll be honest and say, I didn't know that. I didn't know that was true here. So when I was told that my book was being translated into Polish, I was just thrilled because I've always had quite a few Polish friends. and always admired Poland. But I didn't, I mean, I was amazed, and I've been here twice before for various things, but I was amazed that that was happening, and I had no idea that Austrian literature was popular here, and I think that's a wonderful thing, because it's a great literature and an amazing culture, and they have so many writers. As I say, these poets like Jandl, who are barely known, anywhere, who would, if it were a different situation and the country weren't so small, and the language were better known, they would be known, outside. And a lot of this just has to do with power and which countries have power, right? It makes a big impact.
Just one thing, have you been presenting this book also in other European countries, and what was the reaction to it, except Vienna, because I have been watching your meeting with you in Vienna, and I had a little bit, that's why I was asking about all these
in Vienna,
nationalities
I think they have,
issues, because in Vienna it had a different reception, I think, and there was
well, it's
some
going to be
nuances
translated
in
into German. I'm sure there are things in Vienna they don't like. Of course not.
I think the reception in Krakow would be different than in Warsaw.
Yeah?
Because
really? What would the reception be?
It was a part of in Krakow, because it was a part of Austro-Hungarian, and there's still a sort of like a Galician culture in there.
Against
and a little bit different here in Warsaw, in the city where.
Against?
Not against.
But what would the difference be?
It was part of the empire.
Oh.
Yes, and in Warsaw, in the city where, for example, Malevich had his first exhibition, and is considered actually a Polish painter in Poland. Unfortunately, not known that what were his origins, but. The question is about the reception in different European countries.
Very different. Now in Brazil, for some reason, it's being translated into Portuguese, but that's because in Brazil I have a lot of close poetry friends and who are interested in my work, and they're very interested in Brazil. I'm not quite sure why.
Zweig is not there.
What?
Zweig is not in the book, so why are they interested?
Yeah, that's right. They're interested in something different, exotic, maybe. Yeah, you don't know. I don't think in England. Well, I did give a talk in England on it, where they were more interested in perhaps for the Jewish element than they were interested in the Austrian element. I'm not so sure what the reception was. And in France, I don't think there's been much reception, so I can't say. Or in Italy, in the Spanish speaking, I always get translated into Spanish, Portuguese, popular, but I don't know. I'm not sure. Yes?
One more question.
I heard it's the last question coming now, so I'm asking now.
Okay.
You mentioned Gregor Wróblewski.
Yeah.
That you've read him. And you said that he was very dark and so on, of course. But would you mind telling something more about your impressions about? But also another question. And do you know any? Have you had any possibility to read any other Polish contemporary poets?
I think I have, but I never remember the names. I know Piotr Sommer is a Polish poet, I know. I don't, because I have the habit, and that may be a bad habit, of not reading things in a language I don't know at all. I can read a little Russian. I can read Spanish, Portuguese, but when I really don't know the language at all, when I don't know Polish, I read about all these poets, and there's some that have been translated a lot in the United States and that are popular, and I don't pay much attention to it, beginning and then going back to Milosz, because I feel I'm not really reading them, I don't know it at all, because I feel when I do read German poets in translation, or, okay, I can look at it in a bilingual text, but I don't want to read it because I don't really feel I'm reading it. I know that's bad, but I don't believe it. In the novel, yes, but in poetry and translation, I don't feel you can really read it. So the only reason I've read Gregor's is because there was this English translation available, but with a bilingual text. And I think bilingual texts are terribly important, even when you don't know the language, because at least you can look over at the left. And since I do know some Russian, I can recognize some of the Polish words, perhaps, a little bit, or just even see what the lineation is like. I do think that's very important. I don't know how you all feel. But, for instance, Elliot Weinberger has argued that when we've done some things on Chinese poetry, say by Bei Dao, he would put it on the screen and put up the poems by, in Chinese and English. I can't read a word of the Chinese, but I'm very happy to see them on the screen to see how the lines are done. Are they long lines, short lines? Where do they end? What do they look like? You get something, at least from the visual dimension, if you believe poetry has an important visual dimension. Whereas if it's just straight in an English translation, which has been true of, well, name me some of the very famous Polish poets now. I always forget names. Name me some of them and I'll tell you whether... Well, Milosz, yeah. But I don't get anything out of Milosz poetry. I've read his prose. I don't find the poetry interesting, but I always think I'm really reading it in Robert House's translation or something. I don't know.
How about Herbert?
Yeah, no, I never read. I mean, I see it all the time, but I've never read it. I've never read it, and I haven't read Zomborsk, that woman. Yeah, I've sort of looked at it. But when I read it in English, it doesn't look like anything. And that's probably just because all the puns and the sound, I think sound in poetry is central. And it's lost, you know, it is sort of lost. So, I don't know. I don't know if that's true of American poetry in reverse. But when I see it, for instance, I have a good friend, Cole Swenson, who has a thing called La Presse that does French poetry and translation, but not bilingual, because it's hard to get the rights. Bilingual, you have to pay for the rights, right? So it's hard to get. And she'll send me things. She just sent me Jacques Roubaud, who's a French poet I love. And I said, thank you, I'm happy to have it, but I'll read it in French now. I don't want to read that in English. Why should I read it in English, you know? What would I do that for? So I do, that's just maybe my view, but I do feel that way. I don't feel the translation really works out. So Zygmunt Herbert, who everybody does, and who is the poet? Brian Henry has translated Piotr. Who is Brian Henry? Has he translated Herbert? Do you know him? It's somebody you know, I think.
I think it's Alyssa Vallis who translated Herbert recently.
Yeah, but Brian, he translates, oh, it's on the tip of my tongue, another famous Polish poet that he's just done a new edition, well, and he always sends them to me. No, it's not Herbert, but I say I don't read them, that's awful of me, but I don't because I don't know any Polish. If it were a language where, if it's Italian, I can read Italian, I can read Spanish, yes, then that's fine, and look at it, and then I can look over at the other language. But when I really don't know what it should sound like, I don't do it. Is that very bad?
No, it isn't. I find it always very embarrassing to hear questions about Polish poets asked to people who come to visit because they should know something on the subject. Why should they know something on the subject? In fact that they don't know anything about the subject and they admit it is great.
And by the way, there's another thing, which is we have a lot of translation by poets of Polish poetry who don't know any Polish themselves and use middlemen, you know, use in between. And I really think that's awful. You know, Aimé Césaire, the great French negritude poet, Caribbean poet, I love Aimé Césaire, translated by Jascha Kessler, who also did some Hungarian poetry. He doesn't know a word of any of her, and is done by Clayton Eshelman. And Clayton Eshelman then did it with Annette Smith. She would supply him with literal French translations, and then he made it poetic, okay? I think that's very questionable.